We wonder who we are and why we act as we do. We wonder where we came from. If we knew, knowledge of man's past would inform the present and point the way to the future. The story of man's emergence is a sketchy one. At one time, scientists thought that the story began in Asia, where the discoveries of Java and Peking man caused worldwide sensations. In 1924, attention shifted to South Africa, where Professor Raymond Dart discovered the famous Tong skull. The King Midas of fossils was Dr. Robert Broom, a physician with an uncanny knack for unearthing fossil hominids. For more than 20 years, Lewis and Mary Leakey searched Olduvai Gorge before finding a fossil hominid. Professor Phillip Tobias has worked closely with Dart, Broom, and the Leakeys. At the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Tobias pieces together the story of man's origin and development. It is a story he knows well.
On the table here, I've arranged all of the important fossils from South and East Africa, and I've done so in accordance with the position in time. You must imagine that this point is about 5.5 million years ago, and the point right at the back here about 500,000 years ago. So the little spread here before us covers a span of 5 million years. Right at the very beginning, in the earliest part of the story, we have a small mandible, a lower jaw, from Lothagam, which was found southeast of Lake Rudolph, and it seems to be a kind of Australopithecus, a gracile specimen, probably not too distantly related to Australopithecus africanus. A little bit later, we've come up from 5.5 to 4 or 4.5 million years, and from Canopoi, also southeast of Lake Rudolph, we have the lower end of a humerus. That's just about the elbow joint region, and that has thrown a lot of light on our understanding of how the elbow joint worked. It seems, too, to be closely related to Australopithecus africanus. And this tiny remnant comes from Shemaron, just east of Lake Baringo in the central part of Kenya, and that specimen, too, may be an early member of A. africanus. Now, if we come up from 4 million to about 3 million years ago, or perhaps just over, we have a very good sample of fossils from Makopan's hut in the northern Transvaal. Here on the table, one can see specimens representing a lower jawbone. There's the actual specimen, which has been built into this reconstruction, and one can see that it is the jaw of a young child, a child of perhaps 11 years of age, as one can see from the state of eruption. The teeth are rather broad, they're rather robust for the gracile A. africanus, and there are some people who have suggested that maybe there are robust elements at Makopan's hut along with the gracile element known generally as Australopithecus africanus. It's just possible that round about 3 to 3.5 million years ago, as at Makopan's hut, there was a polymorphic population, a population some members of which were like A. africanus, more gracile, and some members of which were beginning to show a move in a robust direction. Now, as we come up from there to 3 million and just under 3 million, we have, on the one hand, this very interesting specimen, which Richard Leakey has discovered not long ago in the site known as East Rudolph in northern Kenya, characterized by having a very large brain case. It's excitingly bigger than any of its contemporaries in capacity, in cranial capacity. The estimated size of the interior of that brain box is about 800 cubic centimeters. Most of the Australopithecus africanus population has a brain size of about an average of 440 cubic centimeters, so this is nearly double its Australopithecine contemporaries. And it's been suggested that it is a member, and perhaps the earliest member, of the line leading up to Homo, and finally right up to Homo sapiens, our present-day species of mankind. He's living at about 3 million years, or 2.9 to be more precise, but alongside him, in East Africa and in South Africa, there are other creatures surviving simultaneously. We've got to get rid of the old idea that there was only one species of mankind or one species of hominid living at any one moment in Africa or anywhere else. Here, as a near contemporary of his, is Mrs. Ples, the famous Sterkfontein V skull, found only about 40 minutes drive out of the city of Johannesburg near Krugersdorp. And this Sterkfontein skull is one of our most beautifully preserved examples of the species A. africanus, Australopithecus africanus. And here, for comparison with it, is the most recently discovered example from Sterkfontein, very similar in many respects to Mrs. Ples, found just a year or two ago, and giving us a further member of the population represented by Australopithecus africanus at Sterkfontein. A little bit more recently, as we move up the time scale, we find that certain very interesting developments have occurred. The robust elements which were just faintly detectable at Makapansgat seem now to have crystallized out into a very definite new kind of hominid in Africa. And we have, not far from Sterkfontein, from the Swartkrans site, one of the very exciting collections of fossils. It's indeed the richest site that has so far been discovered in Africa as regards its yield of hominids, and the kind of hominid from Swartkrans is a very robust member of Australopithecus. We call it Australopithecus robustus. And maybe the robust elements apparent at Makapansgat have now separated off from the gracile elements and become a separate species, different from the species A. africanus. And in East Africa at about the same time, we find that an even more robust kind of creature has come into being, which up there that is known as a boisei, Australopithecus boisei, such as the very lovely specimen found by Richard Leakey east of Lake Rudolph, the jaws which have been found by Yves Copins and by Clark Howell at Homo north of Lake Rudolph, and a little bit more recently still the very fine and well-preserved skull of Zinjanthropus, as it used to be called, which we today describe as A. boisei. So the robust line in South Africa is called A. robustus, and in East Africa, where it is hyper-robust, it's much bigger toothed and more heavily muscled than in South Africa, there we call it A. boisei. Contemporary with this very large, robust ape man at Olduvai, we have a collection of most intriguing little hominids. Hominids to which such delightful names as Johnny's Child, Twiggy, George, Cinderella, and a whole lot of other ones have been given. These little people, pygmies, yet had brain sizes about 50% bigger on the average than Australopithecus africanus, well up in the 600 cc's. Their teeth, if anything, are somewhat on the smaller side and somewhat narrower than those of Australopithecus africanus. They are elongated and rather narrow, in contrast with the very broad and bulbous teeth possessed by Australopithecus, and especially by Australopithecus robustus and boisei. It looks as though this is a later member of Homo habilis, and it was this name that the late Dr. Leakey and I proposed for the group in 1964 on a suggestion given us by Professor Raymond Dart. We called it habilis because habilis means handy. It's the basis of our word ability, and there is very good evidence today that it was this kind of creature that was responsible for our very early stone tools. And so it was, in a very real sense, the world's first handyman. And from Homo habilis, we move up to the next major rung in the ladder, from 1.8 million up to about just over 1 million. Round about that time, the very last of the robust Australopithecines are surviving. The latest one we have in South Africa, for sure, is Kromdraai. And then perhaps the latest in East Africa, represented by that very heavy, large-toothed mandible, or lower jaw, from Peninge on the northwestern side of Lake Natron in northern Tanzania. So, just over 1 million years ago, these old heiries, these poor relations of man, these heavily over-specialized, robust creatures, were still lingering in the continent, both in East Africa and in South Africa. But meantime, Homo habilis, the main line of development leading to modern man, had changed by further increase in brain size, by a number of other features developing, such as a large brow ridge, a thickening of the skull, but very definite, clear-cut evidence of complete uprightness, a further diminution in tooth size, and perhaps a considerable step forward in the cultural capacities manifested by the creature in the form of the stone implements that he used. And maybe, too, as our evidence shows, it was some of the populations of Homo erectus who for the first time managed to master fire, and not only to use fire that nature had created, such as lightning-caused fires or volcano-caused fires, but learnt how to make fires and to keep them going. We've got that in Hungary, we've got it in China. So here is another major step on the line of the Homo story, and we come to the point where we have passed the million mark and are now under 1 million years ago. About that time, I should mention, too, Africanus seems to have disappeared from the scene. Although we have sites of the right age in South Africa, such as Swartkrans, there is no sign of Australopithecus africanus still surviving at that time. The earlier populations had apparently gone on to form Homo. Some of them survived for a while and then apparently disappeared. And now, under 1 million years, the last of the robust Australopithecines, about the million mark, Homo erectus on the other hand, and the mystery man, the little child of Tong, whom we have long believed to be the earliest of all the South African specimens, turns out on new geomorphological dating evidence and also paleontological dating evidence to be the youngest of all of the Australopithecines in the entire continent of Africa. It may have lived less than 750 million years ago. We have always regarded it as the type specimen of the species A. africanus. But when we see it now in this line, there is the disturbing fact that there is something like 2 million years between Australopithecus africanus of Sterkfontein and Makapansgat and the child of Tong. Is that just an error of sampling? Is it that we haven't got the specimens yet from this period? Or does it rather mean we've got to rethink what Tong really is? The Tong child has never been fully and adequately described, and especially does it need adequate description today when we have juvenile specimens of A. robustus and A. boisei with which to compare it. And I believe that a restudy of it now might well establish that instead of it being a latter-day survivor of the A. africanus line, which looks as though it ended about here at 2 to 2.5 million years, it is perhaps the last surviving peripheral population of A. robustus, of which we have an example, say, at Kromdraai, which may be about 1 million years older, maybe less than 1 million years older than the Tong child, maybe only 500,000 years older, so that this child's nearest affinities may turn out to be with the robust line and not with the gracile line. What I've tried to show you is that if you have enough fossils and you know enough about the anatomy of each, and if you know their place in time, layer by layer, then it is possible to reconstruct a family tree of man, the story of man's phylogeny, and I've tried to do that with the particular information at our disposal today. But the reconstruction may alter with time. We don't know whether new facts brought to light in tomorrow's excavation and next year's excavations may not force us to alter a small detail here, a side branch there. But we must always retain the flexibility of mind to alter our reconstructions, our family trees, if the facts demand it. Here, for what it is worth, is one man's interpretation of man's story in this continent of Africa, which has done so much to throw light on human evolution from 5 million years ago right up to the very present. It's a fascinating thought that Australopithecus, although found in Africa, wasn't just the forefather of the black man of Africa. He was the ancestor of every one of us. If you want a scientific basis for the idea of the brotherhood of man today, surely it is that we've all had a common ancestry. We've all descended from the same ancestral population. Australopithecus was the father and the grandfather and the forebear of the Mongoloid peoples of Asia and of America. He was the forebear of the Caucasoid or white peoples, of the Negroid or black peoples, of the Australoid peoples, of the Amerinds, the American Indians, the Eskimos, and the teeming tribes of America right down to the Tierra del Fuegans in the very south, from the Eskimos up in Baffin Bay in the very north. All of these people have come from a single common ancestral stock. This, for me, is an exciting and an interesting prospect. We are all kith and kin. We are all brothers one way and another, even though the relationship may be a little remote between two people born in two different continents. I think this is another very real, perhaps intangible, but immensely important message which we can get from the study of the past.